What's your quick take on what we found from the latest trustees report? What is it signaling to us?
Alarm. I've been searching for words that are strong enough to describe these reports, and in particular the Social Security report. Say that they're concerning reports, I think understates it. I think if we didn't have a dysfunctional political climate, the publication of a report like this would immediately cause lawmakers to snap into action and say, what do we have to do to preserve these programs? And of course, we're not seeing that. But just to give you some numbers, the actuarial shortfall in Social Security, according to this report, is arcanely described as 3.54% of national taxable payroll. And that sounds very impossible for anyone to understand, and it sounds very small, but it's not small at all. So I'll try to translate it. Basically, that's 21% of all future benefit obligations. And that includes benefit obligations to people already collecting benefits. If you express it as a percentage of future benefit claims, it's 25%. So imagine, for example, that Congress were willing to cut benefits immediately to get system finances back in balance. They would have to make those immediate cuts for new claims 25%. Now, again, carry the thought experiment forward. How likely is it that lawmakers would be willing to cut benefits 25% the next day? It's not going to happen. Any changes they do make, they would phase in more gradually. So I'm just making these numbers up, but maybe 1% the first year, 2% the next year, who knows? But they would certainly do it more gradually than that, which means you wouldn't get to that 25% till a couple decades from now, which means ultimately you'd have to be a lot bigger, right? You'd have to get to about a 40% or so benefit change. And again, remember, that's affecting everybody. That's including the poorest of the poor. Presumably, we would not cut benefits 40% for the poorest of the poor, even in the future. So you start carving out exemptions and exceptions for people. You're looking at cuts of 50% and above for middle to upper income people. I mean, the numbers just become astronomical, and that's where we are today. If we continue to defer a solution, the numbers become so large that they are absurd from the standpoint of whether we can continue with these programs as they're historically structured.
Steve, jump in. You're muted.
Yeah, I think Chuck is making a good point. And, that is that, the shortfall in the system that exists today, assumes that the trust fund will run out around the year 2034. And, there's really no politically plausible change on the benefit side, certainly, that could be made today that would avoid the trust fund insolvency. You simply can't cut benefits fast enough and big enough to avoid trust fund insolvency. I mean, if we'd have done this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which, ironically, we knew this train wreck was coming. If you go back and look at the trustees reports going all the way back to the late 1970s, when they enacted the current formula, we've known somewhere around the year 2030 to 2040, that's when the trust fund would become insolvent and or depleted or exhausted, depending on your preferred terminology. So, it's not a surprise. We've known for 30 years that the doomsday, the date of depletion, would somewhere around the mid 2030s. And so we've had plenty of time to make gradual changes. But unfortunately, Congress has continued to kick the can down the road, and they've deferred action. And part of it is political because, you have the two political parties who are saying, the Republicans have never seen a tax increase that they liked, and the Democrats have never seen a benefit cut that they like. And, occasionally you'll get a very small bipartisan group of like maybe 4 or 5 members, and they'll come up with some bipartisan plan that'll do a little on the tax side and a little on the benefit side. And as a result, the rest of their colleagues on both sides of the aisle, reject it. Oh, that's too much in taxes, or that's too much on the benefit side. And so, we keep putting this decision off. And I guess, my greatest fear is we're going to continue to put it off for another decade or two. at that point, the trust fund insolvency is going to be, right upon us. And then there's, almost nothing politically you can do. And the path of least resistance, I think, is general revenue. And, the example here, of course, is the Highway Trust Fund. In theory, the Highway Trust Fund operates in a similar manner, where we collect gasoline taxes, we put it in a trust fund, the money is divvied out to the states to build roads and bridges. But the gasoline taxes have never been high enough to pay for all the construction. And as a result, Congress has routinely put general revenue into the trust fund to make up for the shortfall. And, there's some precedent here for Social Security. Back in 2010, as part of the response to the financial crisis, Congress cut the payroll tax by 2 percentage points. Well, that was like $100 billion a year. And in order to hold Social Security harmless, they replaced the lost payroll tax revenue with general revenue. And so again, the fear is that when we get to 2032 or 2033 and trust fund insolvency is looming around the corner, the path of least resistance is to say, oh, well, we'll just write some IOUs and stuff them in the trust fund and call it general revenue transfers. And, that's going to be the political, solution. But in fact, that, it's certainly not a real solution from an economic or policy perspective.
Yeah, and as Chuck said, that really changes the fundamental nature of the program. And Chuck, as you wrote in an op-ed in Barron's recently, if we're going to make that decision, it should be explicit rather than just by default. But we seem to be stumbling in that direction.